Okay, we have a very special guest tonight, Professor Noam Chomsky, who's Professor Chomsky.
Thanks. Thanks for your patience as well. Well, I don't know if the title that was sent to me was also announced, but if it was, you'll have noticed that it covers about every imaginable base, so I guess I can talk about anything. What I'd like to do is to say a few words about where I think the United States is going, or to be more accurate, where it's being driven by quite deliberate and conscious social policy, taking advantage of significant changes that have occurred in the international economy and the global system during the past 20-25 years. I'm going to keep to the United States, but the comments that I want to make extend in various degrees to other rich societies, the societies that commonly indulge in the self-adulation that's one of the prerogatives of power, but occasionally are described accurately, very occasionally. For example, once by Winston Churchill, at the height of British imperial power, right before the First World War, when he, we got a little background, he was speaking to the British cabinet, and he pointed out, calling for rearmament, and he said, "We have got all we want in territory and wish only to be left alone in unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force." And then he says, "This often seems less reasonable to others than it does to us," for some reason, which means that various measures have to be taken to teach reasonableness. Well, Churchill was alert enough to realize that that's not for the public ears, so that was a secret cabinet meeting. And when parts of it did reach the public about 20 years later, it was carefully sanitized, but has emerged 75 years later in released documents. And maybe if one were to explore documents more carefully, you might even find some accurate descriptions in our internal record. What seemed unreasonable to others also seemed quite unreasonable to more humane people in Imperial England, some of them quite well known. For example, Adam Smith, 200 years ago, 1776, who denounced what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, who were then devastating much of the world, and in fact creating the first world, third world division that exists today, and doing it with ample savagery, as Adam Smith understood and as he condemned. And he also understood something else that Churchill didn't mention in these remarks, namely that there's a domestic analog. That is, the we who want to enjoy their vast and splendid possessions were not the people of England or the people of France or America or others, but rather a sector among them. Those who Smith described as the principal architects of policy, who used their power, their control over the economy, to design policy so that it would be so that their own interests would be, as he put it, most peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. He spoke particularly of the manufacturers and merchants of England who were using power to design state policy in this fashion, following what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. Recall that Adam Smith there's a mythical Adam Smith who you're taught about, and there's a real one who was saying things like this. He was a pre-capitalist thinker with roots in the Enlightenment, and he regarded all of this as outrageous, and he also insisted on relative equality of condition as an elementary principle of justice and morality, a position in which he was joined by Benjamin Franklin and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and authentic conservatives like de Tocqueville years later, all of whom also recognized that it's a prerequisite for anything remotely like democracy. These were truisms hundreds of years ago, and they remain true today, even though they're regularly denied. Well, these same issues arose very prominently at the foundation of this country, among the founding fathers of American democracy, at pretty much the same time. A few years later, 10 years later, in 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, who was basically the main framer of the Constitution, emphasized to the convention that the first priority of government must be, as he put it, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And in fact, the system was designed very specifically and consciously to that end. Power had to be placed in the hands of the owners of property, Madison insisted, so that the minority, the opulent, could be protected against the majority in a formally democratic system. That's the way it was designed, and that's the way it remained. Now, Madison had a rather naive belief that the minority of the opulent would behave as enlightened, civilized gentlemen, like the Republican Romans of his imagination. Imagination, I stress. But he soon discovered that that reality was pretty far from, the reality was quite different. And within a few years, seeing what had happened, Madison deplored what he called the daring depravity of the times as the wealthy came to use their control of government exactly as Adam Smith had described. To put it in, well, using Madison's own words, he said, "The stock jobbers are becoming the Praetorian band of government, at once its tool and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by its clamors and combinations." Earlier in this century, the same thought was put more simply by America's leading social philosopher, John Dewey, who pointed out that politics is the shadow cast by big business over society, and as long as the substance isn't changed, attenuation of the shadow, changes at the margins, will be useful but limited. Let me stress that these are truisms. They've been truisms for 200 years, and they're truisms that are well to bear in mind. Well, these struggles between the minority of the opulent and the majority, which were well understood 200 years ago by leading thinkers who we're supposed to revere but not read, they remain the leading themes of history. And it's worth, I think it's pertinent today to remember how they've been played out over the years. Obviously, I can't run through that, but I'll mention a few points which I think are worth bearing in mind. In the mid-19th century, in the United States, there was a lively and vigorous independent labor press, mainly in places like not too far from here. In fact, the Lawrence and Lowell and the working class towns of northeastern United States where the Industrial Revolution was taking place. And indeed, that independent labor press remained for a long time. As late as the 1950s, there were still about 800 labor newspapers reaching about 30 million people. Later, that was the tail end. After that, they were wiped out by concentrations of corporate capital. And they're very interesting reading. The press was run by working people, by what they called factory girls, young women off the farms who were working in the Lowell mills, or artisans and mechanics. And they denounced what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. In other words, Smith's vile maxim. which they called a demeaning and a degrading doctrine that was destroying the revolutionary heritage of the United States, destroying democratic rights, destroying elementary human values, even destroying their surprisingly high cultural level of those days, all exactly as Adam Smith and James Madison and particularly Thomas Jefferson had warned would happen. Thanks. These conflicts, the conflict of ordinary people with the new spirit of the age, have continued right up until the present. There have been many victories for freedom and democracy and human rights. They have been gained by often quite bitter struggle, and there have been many periods of decline and defeat. And again, that cycle is well to remember. About 100 years ago, the famous radical artisan William Morris in England wrote, "I know that it is the received opinion that the competitive devil-take-the-hindmost system that now prevails is perfection, and therefore finality has been reached in it. But if history is really at an end in this devil-take-the-hindmost system, this vile system as he described it, then civilization will die." However, he went on to say that despite the opinion of learned men that history is at an end, all of history says that this is not so. The claims have been made before, unfortunately were false. And he was right. The struggle continued with victories and defeats. In the United States, the repression of working people was unusually violent and severe by international standards. It scandalized even the right-wing British and other European press. By the 1920s, the opulent minority again believed that history was at an end, that perfection was in sight in the United States, and that the vile maxim that Smith condemned could rule unchallenged. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, at the end of World War I, had pretty much demolished and destroyed the union movement, the labor movement, had undermined independent thought, and it had established an era of business dominance that was expected at that time to be permanent. Working people had no power and very little hope at the peak of the automobile boom of the 1920s, the big industrial development. Any rights that they had were at the tolerance of employers, one foreign visitor observed with some amazement comparing the United States with comparable countries. The leading labor historian in the United States, Yale University Professor David Montgomery, comments correctly that modern America was created over the protests of its working people, vigorous and outspoken protests and fierce struggles, as he puts it, with hard-won victories, but also periods of forced accommodation to a most undemocratic America, notably in the 1920s. Well, again, the predictions of the end of history were proven wrong. Within a few years, popular struggles had considerably extended human rights and democracy, even gaining for working people in the United States the rights that they had achieved decades earlier throughout most of the industrial world in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. Well, the achievement of those rights during the 30s, in the struggles of the 30s, that gave rise very quickly to new conflicts as the minority of the opulent sought to contain these achievements. In fact, the achievement of what had long been regarded as ordinary rights for working people in the 1930s, the achievement of that in the United States set off real fury in the organized business community. The National Association of Manufacturers reacted by warning of what it called the hazard-facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses. Incidentally, if that terminology surprises you and sounds like a Maoist text, you have to remember that the business community is vulgar Marxist, as is the government, just with the values reversed. And that kind of terminology about the rising political power of the masses and all that sort of thing is perfectly standard in government documents and business press. They see themselves as fighting a vicious class war and always have. The evidence on that is overwhelming. Well, they warned that unless the thinking of the masses is redirected, we will be facing a disaster. And in fact, a serious counterattack was launched in the late 1930s. It was put on hold during the war, but picked up with great vigor after World War II. There was a quite spectacular campaign, propaganda and everything else, to try to overcome the rising political power of the masses and to save our preferred way of life, as business leaders put it. They described the task as continuing with the everlasting battle for the minds of men. We have to indoctrinate people with the capitalist story. We have 3 to 5 years, it was claimed, to save our American, what they called our American way of life against this rising political power of the masses. And a huge campaign was undertaken. The scale of it is pretty spectacular. By the early 1950s, about 1/3 of the materials in schools around the country were being provided by business as straight business propaganda. About 20 million people a week were watching propaganda films. The resources of the entertainment industry were mobilized to try to portray, there were several major goals. One was to portray unions as the enemy of the working people. On the waterfront, Marlon Brando's a famous example, honest working man stands up against tough union bosses and everyone ends up happy. To create a picture of harmony and Americanism, meaning the hardworking executive and the sober workman and the housewife busy taking care of the kids all together against these outsiders who are trying to cause disruption by organizing people and getting them to try to fight for their rights and so on and so forth. The campaign was extraordinary in scale. It targeted the churches, the schools, the universities, even recreational programs to win the everlasting battle for the minds of men and to indoctrinate people with the capitalist story, and to try to get one crucial part of it, which has a lot of resonance today, is to try to get people to hate the government. There's a good reason for that. The government, whatever you think of, even though the business knew as well as anybody that government is the shadow cast by big business over society, nevertheless, government has a fatal flaw that corporate power doesn't have. In principle, it's possible for people to participate in it and to influence it. In contrast, corporations are private tyrannies. They're totalitarian in structure, they're unaccountable, and there's no way for the population to become involved in their decisions or even to know what they are. Government, however well controlled by the substance behind the shadow, has the flaw that it is potentially democratic. And therefore it makes good sense to try to direct people's hatred and anger and fear and so on against government and to keep the shadow, the substance behind it, very well hidden. That is the main theme of the massive propaganda to which people are subjected from every point of view. And the end result is the mood that's called anti-politics. If you're angry, and you have good reasons to be angry for most of the population, directed against the government, not against the Fortune 500. Just pay attention to the shadow, not the substance. That and the attack on efforts of people to organize and to realize the potential rising political power of the masses, those are the major themes of very spectacular propaganda campaigns. There's actually some pretty good scholarly work that's just come out in the last couple of years on these topics, and I thought I knew something about it, but it's pretty remarkable to see what the scale was and the self-consciousness. Well, that had its effects. We're, again, now in one of those periods when the end of history is being predicted once again. We're in the midst of an era of a kind of rollback, a very vigorous attack on freedom and human rights and democratic values, and even an attack on markets, contrary to what's being claimed. And it's well to bear in mind the lessons of history, which are rich and valuable. The utopia of the masters, guided by the vile maxim That's been proclaimed over and over again, always wrongly, because people have always found ways to get together and to struggle for decent human values. And there's no reason to believe today that civilization will die, and that what Madison called the depravity of the times will be permanent. Again, a good look at history shows that things aren't all that different than they've been before, and the hopes that were realized before can be again. Well, another accurate description of the rich countries, the so-called developed world, can be read alongside of Churchill's, was given a couple of weeks ago by Carol Bellamy. She's the new director of UNICEF, an American, of course, appointed as usual under quite considerable strong U.S. pressure. But she released the latest UNICEF annual report on the state of the world's children, in which she concluded, the report concluded, that 13 million children die every year from malnutrition and easily treatable diseases. That's up from about 11 million a few years ago. These are lives that could be saved with pennies of aid. The report went on to say that tens of millions of children could be saved from mental retardation and physical disaster at a cost that they estimate at 5 cents per person per year in the rich countries. Well, that wasn't reported in the national press. However, the press did report that on the same day, Congress had called for a cut of 1/3 in the U.S. funds for UN agencies, including UNICEF. So maybe if we're lucky, that can go up to maybe 20 million a year in another year or two. And also called for terminating, or mostly eliminating, foreign aid. The United States already has the most miserly record in the developed world, and long has. And if you put aside the aid, the biggest component of aid, which happens to go to a very rich country, namely Israel, if you eliminate that, then we're just off the spectrum, completely off the spectrum of developed societies. That timing was fortuitous, but you wouldn't have known it unless you somehow found out that UNICEF had a press conference that day. Well, this is by no means a response to public opinion. Quite the contrary. Public opinion continues to show what the pollsters point out are strong majorities, not only in favor of foreign aid, if it reaches the poor, but of even for increased strong majorities in favor of increased taxes for more foreign aid that reaches the poor. This is only one example of a very consistent pattern in the last couple of months, that the allegedly poll-driven policies that are being undertaken are radically opposed to the opinions of the general population. But they are favored by the minority of the opulent, and therefore they are being put through. And if you look just at the headlines, you'll think that the public supports them. That's true in case after case, in fact, almost without exception. Take the biggest case, the balanced budget efforts. The headlines repeatedly tell you, yeah, people strongly in favor of a balanced budget, we have to push that through. Well, there's a sense in that in which that's true. If you ask people, would you like to have a balanced budget? People would say, sure, me too. So you get very high numbers in support of a balanced budget. If you ask people, would you like to have all your household debts canceled by magic? They'd say, yeah, terrific. So people are in favor of canceling household debts. On the other hand, if you go down below the headline and you look at the data and you ask the sensible question, which is down there maybe somewhere at the end of the column, or maybe not, if you ask people, do you want a balanced budget if it's going to mean cuts in education or health or environmental protection and so on, then the figures go down to like 20% in favor, or maybe 25% in favor. So in other words, there's overwhelming opposition to the only serious question. But that you're not supposed to notice. And since the minority, the opulent, are in favor of it as a technique of destroying even the quite limited, by comparative standards, quite limited welfare systems in the United States, it's being rammed through. And the same in case after case after case, if you look carefully. Well, again, there's a domestic analog to what UNICEF reported about the suffering of children throughout the world because of lack of pennies of aid. The domestic analog is right here. It's one aspect of the project that's now underway to try to turn the United States itself into a kind of a third world society. It's not going to be, it's a rich, very super rich country, so it's not going to look like Brazil or Mexico, but to impose the structure of a third world society. That is a sector of great opulence, a large number of people who are suffering or maybe miserable, and then a huge mass of people who are just superfluous, people who contribute nothing to profit making, which is the only human value, and therefore have no human rights. Well, if it's one of our, say, dependencies, like, say, Colombia or someplace like that, you just kill them, or you send out the death squads, or you carry out social cleansing, or something of that sort. In a more civilized country like ours, what you do is coop them up into urban slums, which increasingly resemble concentration camps in which they can prey on one another, or just throw them in jail. The prison population is, through the 1980s, it used to be about 1980, it was more or less at the level of other countries. It more than tripled during the 1980s. It's still going up. There isn't any other country in the developed world, or in fact anywhere in the world, that's even close to it in per capita imprisonment, except for one. Russia just caught up with us after they picked up American values after 1989. But aside from that example, we're way ahead of everyone else. Well, that's the sort of civilized equivalent of death squads and social cleansing. And in fact, it's not that crime has gone up. Crime is pretty stable. It's been stable for about 20 years. Serious, but hadn't changed, maybe even declining. But there is a superfluous population. They got to be controlled. And plenty of people gain by this, remember. This has become a big industry. Private prison systems are now pretty wealthy operations. They're privatized, of course, like everything else. Meaning more profit can be made. In fact, there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal about it about a year ago, pointing out that the big investment firms are making lots of money floating bonds for new prisons, Merrill Lynch and the rest of them. And furthermore, that high-tech industry, the military industry, what's mislabeled defense industry, has realized that they can get in the act. Here's another cash cow, another form of public subsidy to high-tech industry alongside smaller than the Pentagon, but still substantial and growing, which they can get into by selling high-tech surveillance techniques, sticking electrodes in people and monitoring them with supercomputers and so on and so forth. Other kinds of scams of the sort that have kept high-tech industry going at the public expense. So it's another form of Keynesian stimulation of the economy, public subsidy of private profit, and can be expected to grow because of these various contributions to social welfare. Well, as part of this process of trying to create a sort of a model of the third world in a super rich society, which you can't miss walking through any American city now, begins to look more and more like third world cities. One part of the process is the domestic analog of the attack on children throughout the world, or simply the domestic analog of malnutrition and starvation throughout the world. The United States is without parallel in the developed world in the level of malnutrition and often starvation. It reached about 30 million people by 1990, including 12 million children, and 1 out of 6 of the elderly, many of whom are literally starving, the Wall Street Journal pointed out in an article that year. Remember, this is the richest country in the world with absolutely unparalleled advantages. I mean, the idea that anybody is starving is a scandal, but the levels are way beyond anything else in the developed world. This is only 1990, 1991, that's before the Bush recession, which made things even worse, and the Clinton recovery, which was historically unique in that it's the first time that median wages, real wages, continued to decline. That's a decline that's been going on since 1980. They continued to decline right through the recovery. They're still declining right now, maybe even faster. The poverty level in the United States is about double that of comparably rich societies. Poverty among children is about triple the level of other societies. The welfare system is extremely limited as compared with other comparable societies, and one effect of that is that the effect of government spending reduces child poverty much less than it does in other societies, far less, and during the Reagan years went down way below what it had been. Take New York City, the richest city in the world. 40% of children are now below the poverty line. That means lacking sufficient food to maintain growth and development in many cases. Inequality in Manhattan is now greater than Guatemala. Those of you know what Central America is like will know what that means. In Boston, which is another rich city, the city hospital, the one that offers services to the poor people, or though it probably won't pretty soon because they're being eliminated, it had to establish a malnutrition clinic a couple of years ago for the first time ever because it was dealing with third world levels of malnutrition among children, which got much worse over the winter, not surprisingly, when parents had to make the agonizing decision as to whether to feed the children or heat their houses. That's unheard of in developed societies. There are now tens of millions of people who lack health insurance. That's increasing. As I mentioned, the crime rate has been stable or even declining for about 20 years, but the prison population is booming. Support systems for the poor have declined very sharply since the 1970s. If you take, say, AFDC, the one everyone talks about, Aid for Families with Dependent Children, that's been cut by about half since the early 1970s. It was already very low by international standards to begin with. It's now being cut very sharply. Maybe another 5 to 7 million children will be knocked off the rolls. Kids average age about 7, who have to learn responsibility, we're told. The 1980s were a period of there was some economic growth, relatively low by post-war standards, but there was some. About 60% of the new wealth that was created went to the top 1% of the population, and about 40% of families declined in absolute terms during this period. Median real wages have declined steadily since 1980, right until today. For the majority of workers, that means men without college education, real income has declined over 20% since 1980. That's the source of the famous angry white male syndrome that you hear about. Since 1987, took a couple of years for the Reagan reforms to come in, but by 1987 they were hitting even college-educated people, and their college-educated wages started going down in 1987. Most striking has been the decline in entry-level wages, the wages that you get when you first get a job. That's declined 30% for males, 18% for females since 1980. That's a portent of the future. Meanwhile, working hours are going up. People are working an average of about 2 weeks per year over what they were in 1980. The effect of these changes has been to drive lots of women into the workforce. Daycare or any other kind of child care is impossibly expensive. The United States does not have the support systems for parents that other countries have. So, for example, parental leave for childbirth is way lower than other countries. In fact, it's lower, just to give you an example, it's lower than the standards for plantation workers in Uganda at the moment. And remember, this is the richest country in the world. The effect of all of this is people are doing it simply because there's no other way to provide food for their kids. You want to provide food, you work 50-hour weeks, 2 parents. Otherwise, no way, with wages going down and benefits going down and working hours going up, and you have no choices because there's no unions. They've been destroyed, so there's no chance of organizing to react to this. And since there's no very limited daycare and other support system, kids are just left alone. One effect is that contact time between parents and children has declined about 40% in the last generation. That's substantial. High quality contact time even more. The kids are left alone. You get latchkey children, so-called television supervision, with the obvious effects: violence by children, against children, drug abuse, breakdown of families, and so on. It's no secret. All of this has been studied in detail, for example, in a recent UNICEF report written by a well-known American economist, Sylviane Hewlett, who compared the way in which the rich societies, it's called Child Neglect in Rich Societies, in which the rich societies were dealing with the problems that all faced since the 1970s. She found two quite different models. As an Anglo-American, what she called neglect-filled model, which has been a disaster for children and families, and a European-Japanese model, which, facing the same conditions, improved their already better circumstances considerably during the same period. This is a deliberate war against families and children, which has been, amazingly enough, carried out under the banner of family values and conservatism. That's a real tribute to the educated classes to be able to pull that one off, as is the fact that the studies of the topic, like the UNICEF study and others like it, are unreviewed, unmentionable. Try to find a mention of them. As far as I know, the only mention that exists is in an article of mine in Z Magazine on when the UNICEF study came out. They're just not part of the debate, because this is not the right thing to think about if you want to fight the everlasting battle to control the minds of men. Well, like I say, that's a tribute to the educated classes, the classes that we're parts of. The official story, which you hear over and over again, is that these are lean and mean times, and we all have to tighten our belts. That is total hogwash. The country is absolutely awash in capital. While median wages have been going down in the manner that I described, corporate salaries, for example, executive pay has risen 66% during the same period. Capital gains are up about the same amount, 66%. They now form about half the income of the top 1% of the population. Incidentally, if these new flat tax proposals that are being tossed about go through, that won't even be taxable, which means half of the income for the top 1% will be tax-free. This is the ratio of corporate pay, executive pay, to manufacturing workers' pay is far higher in the United States than any other developed country, and the enormous increase in the last years is essentially close to unparalleled, except in England. The business press, of course, is totally euphoric about this. You don't read about lean and mean times in Businessweek and Fortune and so on, or Financial Times. Quite the contrary, they're euphoric. They have headlines like Fortune a couple of weeks ago on why profits will keep booming. An lead article, which points out that in 1993, profits were dazzling despite, I'm quoting it, virtually stagnant sales and continuing decline of wages. 1994, they say, was even more splendid. It was the fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth, and they expect it to continue at least until 1996. Meanwhile, there's an annual study called The State of Working America, the main scholarly study of working people in the country, and it predicts, Michel and Bernstein, that wages will continue their decline while profits continue this completely unprecedented growth. Earnings per share have doubled since 1991. Return on capital has more than doubled since 1980. It's not that business was without problems. So you can read a headline in Businessweek saying, the problem now, what to do with all that cash, as surging profits are overflowing the coffers of corporate America and dividends are booming, thanks in large measure to profits from overseas operations. That's what's called working for jobs for Americans when you listen to it. There's a well-oiled profit machine, another article says. They're reporting the first quarter of 1995, which had a 30% leap in profits, which is pretty spectacular, although they say less than the phenomenal 74% advance of the last quarter of 1994. The Fortune 500, which comes out every year with a big study of the top 500 corporations, this year, May 15th, was absolutely ecstatic. Profits, they said, were up a stunning, I'm quoting it, stunning 54% on a sales growth of 8% and employment growth of 2.6% and declining wages. It's one of the most profitable years ever for American business, and this series of increasing profit is unprecedented. The revenues of the Fortune 500, they say, now constitute 63% of total gross domestic product in the United States. That's more than Germany, more than the United Kingdom. In addition to that, there's huge control over the international economy. And so there's a degree of power over the international and domestic society in the hands of real totalitarian institutions. Because remember, these are private, unaccountable tyrannies. That's, I think, without precedent. Hard to find a precedent for that, and it's going up. It's interesting to look at the particular cases. If you look at the Fortune 500 list, you'll find that some of the biggest increases are, one of the biggest increases in what they call sales is Manpower Incorporated. By sales, they mean selling people as temporary workers. They provide temporary replacement workers. Their sales increased 35%. Kelly, the next biggest one, not much less than that. Way up on the Fortune 500, one of the biggest employers now. The point of that is to make labor markets what are called flexible. If you study economics, you learn that it's good for labor markets to be flexible and to avoid market rigidities. Those are fancy words which mean that it's bad for the economy if people can go to sleep at night and with any confidence that they're going to have a job the next day. That is bad for something that's called economic health. That's another technical term which has nothing to do with the health of the economy, but has a lot to do with the health of the minority, the opulent. So labor markets are getting a lot more flexible, and they're eliminating rigidities like contracts and expectation of a job and that sort of thing, which we all know is terribly bad. Another one that another corporation, an interesting one that shot way up last year was Caterpillar. Profits up 46%, dividends up about the same amount. That's extremely important because right now in Decatur, Illinois, one of the most important labor actions of maybe all of American history, certainly modern American history, is going on. A major effort by three major corporations, Caterpillar, one British-owned multinational and a Japanese-owned multinational, to really destroy the last, what there is left of American industrial unions. And the Caterpillar Corporation has explained, very kind enough to explain its strategy, which the business press reports. Namely, they have been using their enormous profits to develop excess capacity overseas, not for reasons of economic efficiency, but for reasons of class warfare. Because if you develop excess capacity in Brazil or Japan or Europe, and then there's a strike in Decatur, Illinois, you can fill your market orders from the excess capacity and therefore undermine and destroy the workers in Decatur, Illinois. Well, that's a good way to drive to turn the country into a third world country. In 1985, labor costs, which means essentially wages and benefits, in the United States were the highest in the developed world, exactly as you would expect in the richest and most privileged country in the world. By 1990, thanks to the Reaganite measures, including the really criminal destruction of unions, in which the government simply told employers they're not going to enforce the law, so do anything you feel like. By 1990, the United States had reached the lowest level in the developed world. It was then passed by England in the competition to see who can crush working people most, and by 1992 it was second lowest in the developed world. It's one of the reasons Thatcher is so admired here. The Wall Street Journal had an article on that describing it as a welcome development of transcendent importance, which indeed it is for the minority, the opulent. The international business press has pointed out that international conditions offer new ways to achieve this. Not only can, say, General Motors either send or threaten to send production down to Mexico and Brazil and so on, but now they've got a new third world, or rather an old third world that has been returned to Western control, namely Eastern Europe. It's a good bit of what the Cold War was about. And now, of course, things in Eastern Europe are terrible, the press points out, but there was an article in Financial Times, which is the major international business press, called Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins, saying, well, you know, it's pretty rotten, but there's some green shoots, there's some good things. The green shoots turn out to be, as they put it, that with the economic reforms, so-called, the pauperization of workers and the unemployment has reached such high levels that Western corporations can now get workers in Eastern Europe at 10% the wages of the pampered Western workers, who will have to give up their luxurious lifestyles, as Business Week chimed in. Well, as I say, that tells you a lot about what the Cold War was about. Well, this is a picture of what's going on. There are no lean and mean times. There's plenty of capital. It's just being very highly concentrated in the right hands, the hands of the minority of the opulent. Well, what should we do in the face of these catastrophic consequences of contemporary state capitalism? The press has told us. So the New York Times a little while back had a front page story with a headline that read, New York is simply not wealthy enough to afford services to the general public. Read on. The source for this insight was an expert opinion, namely a report to investors by the J.P. Morgan Corporation, which is fifth among the banks in the Fortune 500, suffering from a mere $1.2 billion in profits last year, which incidentally is actually rather low as compared with its competitors who did far better, so you've got to have some tears for them. So the report to investors of J.P. Morgan, which made it to the headline of the front page of the Times, says New York is simply not wealthy enough to afford services to the general public. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is to cut taxes on the rich. Again, the small print in the back pages pointed out that all the tax cuts benefit business. So you cut taxes on the rich, but you increase taxes on the poor, except you don't call them on everybody else. That's not the poor, that's the great majority. You increase taxes on everybody else, but you don't call them taxes. That's very important for those of you who are looking for, you know, employment in serious places. You raise taxes, but you don't call them taxes. What you call them is, I'm quoting, multi-million-dollar reductions in subsidies for cities' mass transit and aid to education and higher education, Incidentally, the word subsidies is kind of interesting. If the population of New York City decides to use their money to improve their public transportation system, that's a subsidy, but let's put that aside. By the multi-million-dollar reductions in the subsidies to mass transit and education, you simply increase the costs for the people who use mass transit and education, obviously. The already astronomical subway costs go up, as they are. The costs of getting an education go up, and somebody pays those costs, and they pay them to the city, so they're taxes, or rather they're equivalent of taxes, but they're highly regressive taxes. The subway costs are not paid by the guys in the limousines up on the street. They're paid by the people who are trying to get to work, or the school children who are trying to get to school. So it's a highly regressive tax, which is designed essentially to redistribute income, like social policy generally. Cut taxes for the rich, increase taxes on the poor, but don't call them taxes. And poor means most everybody, remember. Another aspect of it, as this article happens to point out, but so does 1,000 others that you've read, is that it's necessary to compel welfare recipients to work. Now, there's some interesting assumptions there. One assumption is that a woman who's raising children isn't working. That comes free, as anybody knows who's ever done it. You know. Remember, and in fact, notice that that's true of women's work generally. It comes free, so it's not work. And we even have a proof of that because, as you're all taught in school, we live in a meritocracy, and you can determine the value of work by the amount of income that accrues to it. Well, mothers who are raising children don't get any income, so that's not work at all. On the other hand, a really meritorious work is, say, a speculation in financial markets to try to, against currencies, to try to drive down international growth rates so that people all around the world get poorer. That gets a lot of money. In fact, that's one of the highest paid occupations, as is being an accountant for a corporation and so on. So in other words, those are the really meritorious employment, the most meritorious work, real work, as compared with just raising children, which isn't work at all. So therefore, mothers who are raising children have to be driven into the workforce, so they do some real work. There's a side benefit of that. The side benefit is that since there aren't any jobs, they're going to have to get low-paid, publicly subsidized jobs. And since they're very low-paid, it'll have the side benefit of competing with union wages and driving down wages for everybody. So by driving down these non-working mothers into the workforce, by driving them into the workforce at low wages, you can drive down everybody's wages, while business is worrying about the problem of corporate coffers overflowing. Incidentally, there's another side aspect of this to those of you who are studying economics, maybe. You notice there's a kind of odd contradiction internal to all of this, which somehow doesn't seem to bother anyone. We have to drive these women who are just raising children and not working, we have to drive them into the workforce because obviously it's unfair for them to, get paid for doing nothing. On the other hand, we have to keep the unemployment level high. That's a principle which is advocated by the very same people. This is what's called a natural rate of unemployment. It has to be kept around 6% according to the current theology, because if you don't keep it at 6%, maybe workers will be able to ask for higher wages and we'll have all sorts of tragedies like that. So on the one hand, you have to keep unemployment high. On the other hand, you have to drive women who are just raising children not working into the workforce. Exactly how you resolve that contradiction hasn't been explained yet, but doubtless some sophisticated person has the answer. The mayor of New York did have an answer. He finally came clean, honest. A couple of weeks ago, he came out and said, look, the policies that are being carried out, as was obvious from looking at them, are designed to drive poor people out of the city. There's no place for them in New York. In New York, the only place is for the meritocracy, the people like the J.P. Morgan executives and the ones who are speculating against currencies and so on. Only the meritocracy has a place in New York, and that, of course, will follow from depriving the rest of them, the non-meritorious, of ability to pay their rent or to, ride on the subway or to have food or to heat their homes, or eliminating health care for the elderly and the disabled and so on. That leaves just the right people, the minority, the opulent. The rest will presumably live around the border somewhere in what they call favelas in Rio de Janeiro. They can't be too far away because they have to somehow be able to drift into the city to do all the dirty work. But they should be out on the outside in the typical third world model. The New York Times reported that, another front page story, which explained that, I have to quote this, it explained that these measures will enable the poor to move freely around the country. The measures that we're talking about are deprivation of rent, heat, food, transit, and so on. That's going to enable the poor to travel, to move freely around the country. The headline read, "Welfare cuts provide a chance to move." In other words, the point is all these people were trapped by this dependency, and now they're finally liberated, and they're free to move around the country, but not too far away because somebody's got to clean our laundry. So they're now free, liberated. I mean, the compassion brings tears to the eyes. It's impossible to be a satirist anymore, as a number of people have pointed out who used to try. The world is just satirizing itself, You're lost, no hope. Well, there's a name for all of this. It's called tough love. And it's not a bad phrase if you think about it. I mean, what it means is love for the minority, the opulent, and tough for everybody else. So yeah, tough love. And there has to be tough love for the majority of the people in New York, because as J.P. Morgan has explained, the city isn't wealthy enough to keep them there. There's no tough love, on the other hand, for, say, Cobb County, Georgia, to pick an example at random, not quite, because it's the district of Newt Gingrich, who's heading this campaign. Cobb County, Georgia is a very rich suburb of Atlanta, carefully insulated from any urban infection, very rich. It's, as Gingrich describes it, a Norman Rockwell world of jet planes and fiber optics, which is accurate. If you know anything about jet planes and fiber optics, you will instantly discover why Cobb County is rich. Jet planes and fiber optics are two of the many examples of the public subsidy of big corporations that's called free enterprise. Free enterprise means public subsidy and private profit. And jet planes and fiber optics, like computers and electronics and just about everything else in the high-tech economy, is exactly an example of that. The public pays the costs, private enterprise gets the profit. So, in fact, Cobb County happens to get more federal subsidies than any suburban county in the country, with two interesting exceptions. One is Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, D.C., so that's like where the Pentagon is and so on. And the other is Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Kennedy Space Center. That's another scam by which the public pays the costs of high-tech industry, pretending they're putting men on the moon and that sort of business. So aside from the federal system itself, Cobb County happens to get more federal subsidies than anyone else. In other words, Newt Gingrich is the biggest welfare freak in the country. And here there is no tough love. Here there's no tough love. Furthermore, if you look at the details of how it goes, it's very enlightening. The biggest employer in Cobb County, which remember is the home of entrepreneurial values, where people despise the nanny state and want to get it out of their hair so that their individual entrepreneurial commitments can flourish. The biggest employer there is Lockheed Martin Corporation. Lockheed Martin, which just merged, two big military industries which just merged and have their corporate headquarters there. They are a prototypical example of publicly subsidized private profit corporations. To call Lockheed Martin a case of individual entrepreneurial values, that's beyond the level of satire, I guess, but that's what it's called. When they merged, as payment for their merger, they requested the Clinton administration, which will probably do it, to pay them well over $1 billion. Meanwhile, the executives paid themselves about $90 million, about large part of it, maybe 30 million or so, from public funds, more entrepreneurial values. Right now, they're in line for a $72 billion subsidy for F-22 jet planes, and we need F-22s, and Lockheed Marietta explains why. If you read their statements, they say, we need F-22s because, I'm quoting, it's a dangerous world in which sophisticated fighter planes are being sold. Well, by whom are sophisticated fighter planes being sold? Well, it turns out by Lockheed. So I'm continuing. We've sold F-16s, the current, top-of-the-line plane. We've sold F-16s all over the world. What if a friend or ally turns against us? So therefore, we need F-22s to defend ourselves against the danger that the F-16s that we're sending to various dictatorships might turn against us. Actually, the U.S. has about 3/4 of that market going to public opinion. Here, public opinion is only 96% opposed to the policy, so I guess you could say it's pretty popular by ordinary standards. But we got to keep doing this because, in fact, they're upgraded F-16s, so the taxpayer is paying multiply. They're paying Lockheed to upgrade the F-16 so they can sell them to third world dictatorships with the support of 4% of the population. so that then maybe they can turn against us, so we'll need F-22s, which you guys will pay for, to defend ourselves against this threat. Well, that's the way it works. If you go looking on at the military journals, like Jane's Defense Weekly, the major British-based military journal, you get a little more insight into it. You can discover that the Air Force Director of Science and Technology, General Richard Paul, explained that this is going to, as he put it, enhance our economic security. How? By spinning off dual-use technology. That's a fancy term that means welfare for high-tech industry. Dual-use technology means you pretend it's for jet planes to defend yourself against somebody, but in fact you use it for commercial production, so then you can, praise your entrepreneurial values and denounce the nanny state, which is paying for all of this. It's welfare for corporate America, in other words, which, as General Paul put it, will transition our work, in other words, which will pick up the money that we're giving them thanks to the public payoff. Well, this is not a subsidy, incidentally. This is not like money that goes to mass transit or education, so this is not a subsidy. And in fact, that it is not a subsidy was pointed out right at the end of the Second World War, when the whole system was instituted by the Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, good liberal Democrat, incidentally, who pointed out that he was often called the senator from Boeing when he later became a senator. The Secretary of the Air Force recognized, as did the business community generally, that, well, as Fortune magazine put it, high-tech industry could not survive in an unsubsidized, competitive, free enterprise economy, and therefore the government has to step in to be the savior, but we must not, Symington went on to say, we should not call it subsidy, we should call it security. In other words, you guys out there are supposed to be thinking you're paying for your security against somebody, Martians or maybe people in the third world who we're selling F-16s to or something, but we know it's subsidy, and in fact it is. Virtually the entire functioning part of the advanced sector of the economy lives off that public subsidy. That's well known in the business community, not reported very much. You'll have to look pretty hard for it. It's not counted when people do talk about corporate welfare now and then, but they rarely, if ever, talk about the most serious part of it, which is this part by far. So that's not subsidy, that's security. And in fact, that's the main reason, in my opinion, why the Pentagon spending is staying very high. It's now not very far from average Cold War levels, about 15% below. It's actually higher in real terms than it was under Nixon. The Heritage Foundation, which is the big right-wing think tank that proposes the plans that the Gingrich Army implements, they recently came out with their new budget proposal, which is to cut everything that might help ordinary people, but to increase Pentagon spending, because they know perfectly well that the state sector of the economy is critically important as to put money into the pockets of the folks in Cobb County and others like them so they can rail against the nanny state and insist on tough love for other people. How about the public opinion on that? Same. Of all public spending, Pentagon spending has the lowest support. That is the greatest opposition. So therefore, that's the one that we got to increase, consistent with the rest of the relation between public policy and public attitudes. Well, tough love in this sense is kind of like free markets. Free markets have always meant pretty much what they mean now. It's always been you look through history, it's been a double-edged doctrine. What it means is market discipline for some people, poor people, for example, but plenty of protection for us, for the rich people. We get state protection, we get subsidy. That has always been the case. It's the case now. That's one of the reasons why the third world and the first world are so different, incidentally. They were pretty similar back in the 18th century, and now it's being brought home. So, yeah, market discipline for, mothers with children whose 7-year-old kids have to learn responsibility, but no market discipline for the corporate executives who have to have public funds poured into their pocket by various measures, the Pentagon system being the biggest of them. Well, this goes on, and it's getting late, so I won't give any more details, though there are plenty and they're interesting. But just to give an indication of how far it's gone and why the art of satire is unfortunately collapsing, let me just end by quoting a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, my favorite reading, in fact, with a lot of good news, incidentally, like the business press generally. They had an article with the headline, Congressional Republicans Call for Defunding the Left, a couple of weeks ago. So they're tired of all this public funds going into the pockets of radicals. The story went on to say Republicans take aim at left-leaning groups that get federal grants for assistance programs. Pretty bad stuff. Who are the left-leaning groups? The top one, by far, in the list was Catholic Charities. And if you look down at the explanation, the reason is that nuns and priests, many of whom work without pay, run programs to try to bring to help low-income heating and to run Head Start courses for Head Start programs for poor people. So so Catholic Charities, for that reason, is a left-leaning group, and we got to defund their radical agenda. The next on the list is the AARP, American Association of Retired People, and the reason why that radical group has to be defunded, they explain, is that it has programs, sinks even this low, it has programs to help elderly Americans get jobs. Remember that there's another Wall Street Journal story which said 1 out of 6 of those elderly Americans is suffering from malnutrition, and many of them are, in their words, literally starving. But if somebody wants to try to help them get jobs, we've got to defund these dangerous radicals. And it goes on like that. In fact, you get a pretty clear sense of who the left is. The left, anybody who has any interest in helping human beings belongs to the left and has to be stopped. Incidentally, for people who consider themselves as being on the left, that's not only pretty flattering, but also kind of encouraging, because it means that the left is a vast array of people, in fact, which is not totally untrue. If you look at public attitudes, it's virtually everybody. Anyone who cares about human beings has to be stopped, because the goal is to turn the country into something that looks like the third world, with the minority, the opulent, well protected, plenty of state subsidies. Heritage Foundation is going to make sure of that, so they can be, big entrepreneurs like the CEOs of Lockheed Martin and the rest of Cobb County. But the rest of the population gets the tough part of tough love. Well, these things are not laws of nature, plainly. They are human decisions. They're being made within human institutions. It's been done before. It's been combated before. It's been successfully combated before. I gave a couple of examples before, and there are many others. It's never been easy to try to defend and struggle for human rights and freedom and democracy and justice. It's never been impossible. It's not easy now, and it's not impossible now. And I think there has rarely been a moment in history when that choice has carried such enormous human consequences. Thanks.